every one of you this morning. Our Open Heart family sent me a text this morning because I joked last week about, the way that it was looking, and I said people would say, well, John's not going to see me this morning. And he sent me a text and said, you aren't going to see me this morning. But anyway, this month we are featuring a new thing. We're still doing TNT, and we still have the materials over there for those of you that wish to follow. But this month, our theme is New Light Through Old Windows. New Light Through Old Windows. And what I'm really focusing on this month is, while we know that the science of mind teachings are something that are encompassing of all different faith traditions, and how we see it as being that which takes the threads of different religious ideas and all of that and pulls them together. We know that for many people, the Bible still is a place and a source of wisdom. And it is something that even Ernest Holmes himself, Mary Kirkland and I had a conversation a little bit earlier this morning about the daily guides in the Science of Mind magazine. And if you read them this month, they're by Ernest Holmes. They do that every October. And much of what he quotes and talks about are from scriptures. And so I wanted to take that same approach this morning, but to look at them from maybe a different light and a different understanding than you might get were you to go into a traditional church. And people who were a part of the congregations that I pastored that were more traditional even told me then, well, you don't preach or approach them like a regular minister anyway, whatever that means. But still, taking them and looking at them in a fresh way, a new light through old windows. And one of the texts that is important for me is one that's found in 1 Kings, the 19th chapter. And it's about one of my favorite figures from the Bible, Elijah. Because Elijah and Elisha are two of my favorites out of what we call the Hebrew Bible. Some people call it the Old Testament. But those two are something about both of them that I really like. And in that is where I'm approaching things today. The 1 Kings, the 19th chapter, that story that's there. But to talk about this in another different way and to look at it in a different light, maybe than some people would. And so a part of that is, a few months ago, I participated in a forum that was held, that was sponsored by the Red Door Foundation. And the Red Door Foundation is one that's devoted to ending HIV/AIDS in the community, particularly among black gay men. And they had a panel of ministers to talk about, in particular, the black church in relationship to black gay men, because a lot of the woundedness that they feel has come from the black church. A lot of things people have had to say. And there were a number of us that were on the panel, and so they asked each of us what our particular motivation was for why we felt the way that we felt and how we reconciled various things like that, and people gave their scriptural references and everything. And when it got to me, I said, well, for me, the ultimate authority is not found in any particular text, but it's found within. And I feel like that when we're able to take the moment to be quiet, to be still, to really trust that we are a part of an abundant universe that gives us all that we need, we can find our own source of authority, our own source of what's right, our own source of how we should approach things. And there was silence in the room. But I saw a few people nodding their heads. I saw some smiles. Some people who came up to me afterwards said, I appreciated what you said, and that's the way that it was. But I was talking about that inner authority, that inner voice, that is really where Elijah found himself searching for. Because if you understand this passage of scripture, it's something that happens. It happens right after Elijah has that big showdown on Mount Carmel. where, if you don't recall the story, Elijah is there and he has a showdown between himself and the prophets of Baal. And it's really kind of a graphic story. If you look at it in the Hebrew, we don't get the full flavor of it in English. But there, Elijah is talking to the prophets of Baal, and they have a contest, and they set this altar up, and he challenges them to get Baal to light that altar. And they do all of the things that they do, and nothing happens. And then Elijah starts talking trash. I mean, this is really in the text. If you read it in the Hebrew, Elijah is talking trash. And I've had some people get upset when I say that. But if you read it in that language, you will understand he is really dogging Baal. I mean, he says all kinds of stuff. I mean, if you talk about playing the dozens, he plays the dozens. And he goes and he's telling them all of this stuff about Baal. He says, you know, he's not answering you. Now, the translation that we have says, well, maybe because he can't hear you. But what it says in the Hebrew, and I'm not going to be graphic, but he says he can't answer you because he's in the bathroom. Take care of it. But it's not graphic. And then what Elijah does then is that not only does he make the effort to burn the altar, he has them douse it with water. Then he prays and it lights. And all of that happens. And he's victorious. And then there's some things that are less fortunate where he goes on and he has the prophets of Baal killed and all of that, and then goes on. And then he hears that Jezebel, who's the king's wife, found out what happened. And Jezebel is the main person in that kingdom who was promoting Baal and who was behind Baal and all of that. And she gets upset and she sends the word out, tell Elijah that what happened to them, to my prophets before the day is over, is going to happen to you. And so Elijah gets scared now, because Jezebel, if you think about it for a moment, how many women out there that you know have the given name Jezebel? Now, there's some people we may call Jezebel, but that's not what their mama named them. And so what happens is that Elijah gets scared, and he goes on the run. And I look at that and I see how we can have victories and things can be going well for us in our lives, but yet in the midst of that, we sometimes forget the fact that we had things go well. We forget our successes. Instead of building on them, we go hiding. And that's what Elijah did. He went hiding. He was running from Jezebel because he knew she was not someone necessarily to be played with, and he had forgotten what he had just done. He had forgotten his victory. So he goes out, and God has to provide for him and provide him food and all of that, and he's fed. And it's a reminder again of God being with him. But here's where I'm headed to. Then he has this experience where he's frustrated, he's discouraged, he's frightened, he's afraid. I mean, some of us can relate to that in our lives, where we're frightened and frustrated and uncertain about things. We're fearful, we have anxiety. But there Elijah is. And he goes to Mount Horeb. And you have to understand, in the Hebrew understanding of that day, they saw mountains of places of refuge, and also mountains of places where you would encounter God, where you would encounter God's presence. As a matter of fact, one of the things that was said was whenever the Israelites would fight people, if they turned and started heading toward the mountains, their enemies would turn back and not follow them, because the belief is that their God resided in the mountain, and that's where their power was. And that's how, when you hear people talk about the names of God, El Shaddai literally means God of the mountain. So Elijah went to the mountain, and there at Mount Horeb, he was there hiding. He was in a cave, he was shaking, and he hears this voice say to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing?" And if you think about it, we have that same kind of opportunity and relationship in our lives, to be in communication with God, with Source, with all there is. And Elijah was honest and said, I'm afraid, I'm scared. This lady Jezebel, this Jezebel, is after me. And she's ready to kill me. And so Elijah is, at that moment just asking for some type of sign, some type of reassurance, something that would help him to again, not be afraid, and remember that God was with him, that God was his source, that God was his strength, that God was his power. You heard me say last week about one of my friends that would call me up every now and then and say, Gilmore, I need a burning bush moment. Elijah was looking for something to tell him that it was going to be all right. Something to assure him that all was well. And so at that moment, he gets the idea that he was going to really, really in that moment know the presence and the power of God. So he goes and he stands at the face of the cave. And as he does so, there comes a big earthquake. And the earthquake passes, but somehow he didn't feel like that God was there. And then there was fire. And the fire came, I guess, it wasn't a burning bush, but it was fire anyway. And all of that came, and then still didn't feel like, again, that wasn't enough, that wasn't it. Didn't feel like God was there. And then ultimately, there was a strong wind, and it came, and all of that, and still it wasn't there. And as I think about that, and as I look at that, I think about how so often we look for God in the big things. And if we're going to be assured that God is with us, it's got to be the big stuff. It's got to be the winning the lottery. It's got to be it's a magnificent and a giant church. The mega churches are where God is and where everybody's running to, and all of those things that we get fascinated with bigness in this society. And the first thing we want to know is how big something is, how many people, how much money, all of those things, and looking at all of that. But that can be empty. And for Elijah, it was empty. He didn't find God in all of that. And then it says that after all of that happened, Elijah heard, in the texts and translations often say, a still small voice. Now, it's something to really get at, because again, the Hebrews were masters of playing with languages and ideas and images and everything. This still small voice, we think about it, he was meditating. He heard the still small voice. But it was saying something more than that. Because the Hebrew says that it was a weak voice. Couldn't almost hear it. It was so weak. Sounded almost like something that was sick or didn't have much power behind it or anything like that. And that's a part of one of the paradoxes of Scripture sometimes, is that which is least likely to be turns out to be the most likely. Mm-hmm. The least likely to be turns out to be the most likely. Go back to another story. When Elisha, was looking for some food, and he was directed to go to the widow, and the widow was the least likely person to have food. That's where he found it. And so to hear assurance that God is with us, that God is there from a voice that is weak, that is almost non-existent. But then when we activate our faith and begin to understand that even in the small things, even in the mundane things, even in the minute things, even in the everyday things, even in the ordinary things, that we can be reminded of God's presence, of God's power, of God being with us. That's one of the things we talk about when we first start studying this teaching. That as we learn that the universe is responding to our thoughts and our intentions and what we put into it, we'll do a little small thing like, I remember one time being in a very crowded food court at a mall in Atlanta with Shelly and one of her friends, and I'm thinking, there's no way we're going to ever find a seat once we get our food and all of that. And there were so many people because it was a holiday. And I said, I'm just going to know that at the right time, the seat's going to open up for us. And would you know it, as soon as we got our trays of food and we turned around, there was a family that had been sitting there, and they got up right as we were walking over. We sat down, knowing that. And that's like something small. But the thing of it is that we take those small things, if we take those ordinary, mundane things, and allow them to be a reminder that we have a presence and a power that never leaves us, because it's within us. Because it is who we are. It is the very essence of who we are. That still small voice that Elijah heard, it let him know something. It let him know that even while he felt that he was alone, even though he felt like that everybody was against him, that still small voice assured him that if you just get up from here, if you get over your fears and your frustration and your depression, if you just get up from where you are, if you look beyond appearances, if you remember that I was with you on Mount Carmel, I'm with you now, and if you head on in there, you will find that there are other people with you. You will find that there's 6,000, getting back to the big thing, people, prophets that have not kissed the feet of Baal, the text says, but ultimately you will understand that you are not alone. You are never alone. And see, when we allow ourselves the time, the opportunity, in the midst of all of the busyness of life, I think one of the reasons why it was such a still, small, weak voice was so that Elijah could turn everything else down. He could turn his fear down. He could turn his frustration down. He could turn his worry down. He could turn his anxiety down. If he were living today, he would have to turn his phone down, turn his MP3 player down, have to turn his television down, have to turn all of those things down. That there's a time and a moment in our lives where we got to turn everything down to hear that voice that is saying, I am with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. And as I was thinking through this message this morning and allowing it to kind of brew and percolate and marinate and all of that in myself, I thought about the song that Ricky Byers Beckwith sings, where she says, from within, I lift my heart to see eternity. Turn within, and now I can begin to see the face of God. The face of God is all I am, and the face of God is all I see. And when we turn within, truly within, what we see is amazing, because it's the face of God. It's our face. And all we are is the face of God. And so it is. So it is.